For the next section, we're going to have a 45-minute discussion of the first 10 verses of Genesis. So I'll start off by reading the first 10 verses, and then Doug Hamp can initiate the discussion, and then for the next 45 minutes, you both are free to discuss. So with that, Genesis 1 through 10 states, "In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, Let there be light, and there was light. And God saw the light, and it was good. And God divided the light from the darkness. And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And the evening and the morning were the first day. And God said, Let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters. And God made the firmament, and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament. And it was so. And God called the firmament heaven, and the evening and the morning were the second day. And God said, Let the waters under the heaven be gathered together unto one place, and let the dry land appear. And it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and the gathering together of the waters called the seas. And God saw that it was good." So, Doug Hamp, you are free to speak.
All right. Well, again, Doug, I think this is a fun discussion, and I'm glad to hear that you've come by way of the young earth. I wish you had stayed there, because I think it just makes so much more sense. And there's more at stake here. It's more than just what happened way back when, but I think it also will influence how we look at things that are yet to come. But going back to the text there, the whole premise of the ruin restoration really exists between verses 1:1 and 1:2, and that's why I've spent some time there, and I want to show that the supposed break between 1:1 really and 1:2 is based on really verse 2. That's the big culprit, and in verse 2. In the New King James, it says, "The earth was without form and void." And what we have in the Hebrew is a very interesting form. It says, "Ve'ha'aretz haita." Now, there's two things that Cumstance and others want to try to do. They want to say that the word "and," or the Hebrew "ve," should be translated as as a disjunction instead of a conjunction. Basically, it means "but." And though that is possible in Hebrew, it's purely subjective. It just depends on what the reader thinks should be supplied there. And again, it's not an objective choice; it's a subjective choice. And then it's also the word "was," and there many people suggest that it's based on the word "became" instead of the word "was." But the phrase here, what happens in Hebrew grammar, when you put the subject at the beginning of the sentence following the word "and what you're doing is you're drawing out attention to something. And that's why I'm suggesting that this becomes a parenthetical statement. Sometimes people call it a copulative clause. Others have called it the vav explicavitum. That's a nice fancy phrase for that. Dr. Randall Booth calls it a discontinuity. And there's a number of places that we actually find this in Scripture, this same exact phraseology. We find it in Genesis 13:2. It says, "Now Abraham was very rich." And again, instead of putting the verb first, because in Hebrew we put the verb first, then it's followed by the subject. In English we don't do that, of course. We start with the subject, and then we have the verb. For example, Johnny ate the hamburger, right? But in Hebrew you'd say hamburger, Johnny ate. And that's the difference. Or the dog chased the cat. That's a good English sentence, but in Hebrew it would be chased the dog the cat. And it's just when you switch it around, you're drawing emphasis. You're breaking the flow of the sentence. And in Genesis 1:2, that's precisely what we have. It says Ve'ha'aretz haita. So now the aretz there is the word earth, and it's being brought to the front because it's saying, wait a second, there's something special about this that you need to know. And there really is something special about it, because in Genesis 1:1, we're told that God created the heavens and the earth. You're like, oh, wow, that's pretty amazing. But then in verse 2, it's already like, okay, wait a second, time out, hold on, I got a parenthetical statement. And he says, well, now the earth. Let me tell you about the earth. Let me explain what the earth is all about here. Because lest you think that the earth is the ball of dirt that you're standing on today, it's not. It really isn't. The earth, back in Genesis 1:2, was basically unformed. Think of cement in a cement mixer, all right? And for those that are having some trouble imagining that, I have a little screenshot for you, just so that you can get a look at that. I mean, I'm sure your imaginations work, but again, this is really what the term is. What's happening? That it's formless and void. It was not destroyed and chaotic. It's formless and void. It has no particular shape yet. Here are the Hebrew words tohu vavohu. And so it's amorphous. It doesn't have a particular shape. Just like cement coming out of a cement mixer, it doesn't have any particular shape yet. You can't really say, what's the shape of the cement? And you're like, well, it's kind of soupy still. It doesn't really have a shape yet, but it's going to have a shape. And that is going to become very important as we go on. So instead of seeing the terms here for tohu vavohu, that it became formless and void, or that it became chaotic, it's basically God is just throwing some dirt in the cement mixer, and Genesis 1:2 records that for us, saying now the earth at this point was still in the process of being built. And when we look at the grammar, again, I've already explained that now the earth, it's really a parenthetical statement. That's what's happening. If we then go back and look at the terms for tohu vavohu, we're going to find that even if you go back and you look in the Greek, for example, now I don't believe in going to the Greek first, but some people say, well, what does the Septuagint have to say about that? Well, the word that's being used there just means to equip, or to fully furnish, to prepare, to arrange, to build something, to make ready, to bring a structure into being. And that really is a pretty good translation, because the Septuagint translators are translating the term tohu vavohu as being something that is just not quite ready yet, just like that wet cement. You couldn't say that, when God created the earth and there was wet cement, you'd say, well, gee, this is no good. If you were to come to my house and I'm building a house and you say, well, what's that cement doing in your cement mixer? Like, well, it's not done. I mean, give me a second, I'm working on it, right? So the cement in the cement mixer isn't going to stay in the cement mixer, and it's not going to stay wet. But if you were asking what is the condition at that very point, I'd say, well, it's wet cement in the cement mixer, but I'm going to fix that. All right, so that has to do with the term tohu vavohu. And again, going back to the original words that I pointed out, and the earth was, not became, is that this is setting this as a parenthetical statement. So in Genesis 1:1, we're told God created the heavens and the earth. So he creates a dimension. Remember, before creation, what was there? It was just God. I mean, was there the blackness of space? Was there all this other stuff? No, there was just God. I mean, it kind of hurts your head, but there was only God. It wasn't God floating around in space. No, there was no space. There was God, and God alone. So he then creates a dimension outside of himself. He fills it with matter, which he calls earth, and then he stops and says, now by the earth, what I mean is that it's not the ball of dirt that we're on today. The earth at that point was actually water, and then he's going to then create that into other stuff, and then the dry land comes out of that, etc. And so I could kind of break there if you want to talk about that, Doug, or I got a few more points if you'd like, and then we could go on from there. But I mean, there's a whole bunch in Genesis 1:2. So,
I would say go ahead and finish, if you would, go ahead and finish your thoughts on 1:2.
Okay.
And most of my thoughts of the first 10 verses really deal with with 1-2. So I think it would be good. Go ahead.
Excellent. Well, so just to look even closer at the term tohu vavohu, another argument that is used to suggest that this is a construction, a ruin and reconstruction, is based on Jeremiah 4:23. And in 4:23, it says, I beheld the earth, and indeed it was without form and void, and the heavens they had no light. And people say, well, see, therefore, because there is destruction going on in in Jeremiah 4:23, therefore the term tohu vavohu must be used to talk about destruction or judgment of some sort. And now, keep in mind that the term tohu vavohu, without form and void, tohu vavohu in the Hebrew, is used only twice in Scripture, that phrase by itself, the tohu vavohu. The term tohu is used altogether 3 times in the Bible, right? And the word vohu is not used very much at all either. So we have some words that are in the Scriptures, but they're not very common. So that's part of the trouble here, is that we have words that are not very common. They're not attested in other languages. So, for example, the word tohu seems to be a waste or a desert, according to Gesenius. They suggest that it might be based or close to the Arabic word meaning empty. But again, it's a word that is also used for emptiness or vanity. But it's used only a handful of times in Scripture. I mean, this word is used in Isaiah 41:29, 44:9, 49:4, 59:4, 1 Samuel 12:21, and Isaiah 40:17 and 23. I mean, it's used only a handful of times, and we don't find it in cognate languages. So that's another trouble. The word vohu is an unused root, which properly appears to have had the signification of purity, according to Gesenius, which in Arabic is partly applied to brightness and ornament. But again, we don't really find this in other languages. So the 3 times that it's being used, we have to say, well, we can only judge it based on the context. And the context, I mean, we have Genesis 1:2, Jeremiah 4:23, and Isaiah 34:11. So we don't have a lot to draw from. That's the trouble. And so there's not a lot to draw from. But let me go back to Jeremiah 4:23, because I think this is really important. So this idea that the earth, he says, I beheld the earth, and indeed it was without form and void, and the heavens they had no light. I beheld the mountains, and indeed they trembled, and all the hills moved back and forth. I beheld, and indeed there was no man, and all the birds of the heavens had fled. I beheld, and indeed the fruitful land was a wilderness, and all its cities were broken down at the presence of the Lord by his fierce anger. What's happening here is Jeremiah is actually taking a look into the future. He is seeing the destruction of planet Earth when Jesus comes back. What are we told about the time that Jesus comes back? We're told that every island and every mountain is going to move out of its place. We see that in Revelation 6:14. We see it in Revelation chapter 16, verse 20. We see it all over the Hebrew Scriptures. We see it in Habakkuk chapter 3, where we're told that when God comes back, that the mountains, it says that the everlasting mountains were scattered, the perpetual hills bowed down. And, again, we find it all over the book of Isaiah. In fact, the same phraseology that we find in the book of Revelation, we find in Isaiah chapter 2, we find it in chapter 4, we find it in chapter 11. We find it big time in Isaiah chapter 24, that the earth is going to stagger like a drunk, and it's going to totter like a hut, and it's going to fall and not rise again. I mean, that is the time that the mountains are going to just become nothing. And what's so interesting is that when you have a massive earthquake, there's a process known as soil liquefaction. And soil liquefaction is just a fancy way to say quicksand. So the islands and the mountains moving out of their place they will become quicksand. And if they become quicksand, that means that they're amorphous. That means that they have a liquid type property. And if they have a liquid type property, then they don't have any particular shape or form. And that's what we find like the cement in the cement mixer. It doesn't have any particular shape or form. It's not that it's been destroyed. It doesn't mean destruction. Certainly in Jeremiah there will be destruction. And the return of Jesus there will be destruction. But that's not what the term actually means. The term actually means to be amorphous without any particular shape or form, just like quicksand. So, those are kind of the main arguments that are being used, and they don't stand up. They fall apart. And, if we can't prove that, then, even the question of when did Satan fall and all those other interesting topics, though we can get to those, but I think, I don't think there's much to stand on if Genesis 1:1 and 1:2 don't stack up. So I will let you interject now, Doug, and kind of make your case, and we'll go from there.
Very good. Well, it is amazing how a great Hebrew scholar can be wrong.
Touché.
Let me see if I can provide, again, what I'll need to do, because I am not a Hebrew trained person as yourself, is I will make mention of certain other authorities and folks that I've read, and I'll do that from time to time. Let me just kind of walk through and talk about some of the salient words. I think, as I said, regarding Genesis 1:1, we both agree that it is the first creative act of God, that he did create the heaven and the earth. We both agree that the term bara is a kind of an equivalent to the Latin ex nihilo, creating out of nothing. I would compare that, and I believe you would probably agree, that there is a distinction between bara and the word esa, which tends to mean made or produce or prepare or even to appoint. For instance, we read later, and God made two great lights, the greater light to rule the day and the lesser light to rule the night, and he made the stars also. The term there is asa, it is not bara, and it tends to suggest, I believe in the context, that God is establishing or reappointing the role of responsibility for the great lights in the sky. So again, I will be taking the position that as we move to Genesis 1:2, that there is a disjunctive, that and should be translated but, because of the context. And so I think that the way that we will come back to the issue of the sun and the stars and the moon and so forth, God does create light initially. He separates the light from the darkness and calls the light day and the darkness night and so forth. But the term I'm really getting at to here is that asa, made, means something different than bara, to create. Moving on, I'm going to move on now to verse 2. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And a quick comment that I would make, there's no question that the translators of the King James Version, the Authorized Version back in what I believe was 1611, that probably, as any translator tends to do, they tend to bring a bit of their own theology to the translation. And it is, I would say, that the young earth view was probably in the minds of the translators in 1611. I think that there is evidence that both views were held from time to time throughout the history of the church. But it would seem that the King James translators probably had that in mind, because they did use the term and in their translation, and they used the verb haya. They used and translated it into English as was. Tohu and bohu, without form and void, we'll talk about next. But first off, in terms of whether or not the second verse should begin with the conjunctive and or the disjunctive but. As you said, Doug, and I agree, I think it really has to be in the context. I think we have to look at the whole context before we would understand which is the proper way to take the term. Now, as to whether or not the verb hayah should have been translated was, I think there's quite a bit of evidence in the scripture to suggest that it could well have been translated became or had become. And that there was, I would not say a parenthetical comment, I would say that there was, in the beginning God created the heaven and the earth. Pause. However, or but, the earth became without form and void. And we'll talk about why, not just from the Old Testament, but from the New Testament. I believe that that is the way the verb should have been translated. Even though, admittedly, it was not translated that way by the folks in the King James translation group. According to Strong's, the word hayah can mean to be, to become, to come to pass, to exist, to happen, to fall out. So it can certainly indicate some type of a past perfect tense in which something specifically came into a certain state, and so that is in effect the way that virtually all of the folks that support the ruin and restoration theory from the 19th into the 20th century have taken it. For instance, Finis Dake, who wrote predominantly in the 1940s and 50s, he wrote a book called Another Place, Another Time, Another Man. He made this quote, I'll read this statement. He said, "This understanding is clear from at least 134 places where the King James translators correctly rendered this sense of hayah. A few examples will suffice, however. It was God, after God breathed into Adam the breath of life, that man became hayah, a living soul. Another example, when Lot's wife looked back on the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, she became a pillar of salt. And so there's clearly examples in the Old Testament in which this verb was translated perhaps more colorfully, became, as opposed to kind of a fairly neutral was. I can just imagine, though, Doug, I bet you can too, here you have this group of translators, and they come upon the first verse, and they're all going, yeah, we all agree on this. Then they come to the second verse, and they all start discussing about how they should translate this verb. And they probably got into some pretty good discussions right then, because they were all certainly aware they could be translated either as a simple past tense or some type of a past perfect tense. And so I believe that in fact, probably led to their first major dispute. So now let's move on, though. So we think that I believe that the verse should begin but, and then that the verb, the earth should be, the verb should be became, and then tohu and vohu. Let's talk about that. I agree with you that, just as you said, in terms of looking at Jeremiah and its usage, which, let's see, that is Jeremiah 4 verses 23 through 26. I agree with you that we are dealing here with a sense of a wasteland or a wilderness. I would say that what Jeremiah was describing was judgment, just as you indicated that he was depicting or describing at the end of time. We are both believers in eschatology, and that the world is heading towards a true apocalypse, and I believe you are correct. But that, of course, tends to lend credence to the notion that those of us that believe in the ruin and restoration theory hold, which is that the reason the world had become a wasteland was it was under some form of judgment. And, of course, we believe that it was under a form of judgment as a result of Lucifer, or Satan, who had sinned in the ages past, and the earth had been turned into a chaotic mess, a wasteland, if you will. So we agree that that was the meaning of tohu, that it is a sense of judgment. I think it's amplified, though, even more when we talk about the use of the term darkness. When we go beyond tohu va bohu, and we talk about darkness, that darkness, hoshech, if I'm pronouncing that right, which means obscurity or darkness or a secret place, that darkness itself is generally in the Bible, both Old Testament and New Testament, associated with judgment. It's associated with the absence of God. God is light. It's associated with sin or evil deeds. And so my argument would be that that the darkness that was upon the face of the deep was in fact a darkness as a result of judgment. And that seems to be the cosmology that's going on here, is that the earth has been completely clouded over by a heavy envelopment of water, and that the water was covering the earth for a very long period of time. It could have been thousands of years, it could have been millions of years, and all of life ceased to exist upon the world. And that's in effect what the ruin and restoration theory argues, is that the world had been turned into a dark, watery, chaotic heap. And so when we read that God, in effect, brought life back to the world, he was, in effect, recreating, remodeling, or reconstituting the earth. And how long and how old the earth was, we do not know, but it appears that from the language used in Scripture, that it may have been for a very long time. We'll talk more about this when we talk about some of the New Testament uses of the terms world and foundation and so forth. But one other comment I would make in terms of the deep, that darkness was upon the face of the deep. The deep, the Hebrew word is tehom, and it tends to relate to the concept of the abyss, deep places, recesses, the primeval ocean, the abyss or the grave. And it is, if it was the earth is being described as a grave, waste-like, almost like the bottomless pit, as described in Revelation, and that was the state that the world was in. And so the question then becomes: is it conceivable, or is it consistent, that when God was creating the earth, that he created the earth initially, he sort of created the raw materials, and then he took the raw materials and he created the earth from those? And this gets into perhaps a philosophical concept, which is whether or not when God created, he created in effect sort of a chaotic mess to begin with, and then turned that into a beautiful creation. And that is, as you point out, that is one of the discussions about Isaiah 45, I believe it's verse 23. I will find it here. I'm looking for where I have that. 45:18. For thus saith the Lord that created the heavens, God himself that formed the earth and made it. He hath established it. He created it not in vain, which was the tohu. He formed it to be inhabited. I am the Lord, and there is none else. So the argument here is that from the very inception, God's creative act was to create the world through a process that brought it into a beautiful state, a world not created in vanity, which is what tohu can mean, not a place of chaos, which is what it can mean, but created it in a form to be inhabited. And so, again, we're using a scripture here to reinforce that argument. We talked about the Jeremiah 4 passage, and let me see if there's any other points I wanted to make on this before we moved on. Probably the last point, I would just jump into verse 3. And Josh, I assume I'm doing okay on time. Do I have another minute or two?
Yep.
Very good. All right, so moving on to verse 3, which I'm grabbing that. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. Of course, the Spirit is the ruach, which is a feminine noun. which is interesting because it suggests that the Spirit of God may be a feminine aspect of God. And moved is, see if I can pronounce this, rakhath. I'm not sure if I did that correct, Doug, but you can correct me if I'm wrong. I didn't. Okay.
Merachefet is how you say that.
Oh, moved? Moved is?
Yeah.
I have moved down as rakaf. Oh, well, Strong's failed me.
The root is rachaf, but the actual word, which is a participle being used there, is merachefet, which is a continuous kind of action that's going on. Yeah.
All right. So Strong's just makes the comment, which I found to be kind of colorful, that that the movement of the Spirit of God was a bit like a hovering. The word has sometimes been used like brooding, like a hen will brood over its chicken. You sort of get the sense that the Spirit of God was, as it was hovering upon the waters, there was, a brooding, a sense of perhaps sorrow. Perhaps it was a sense of sorrow being turned into joy. But nevertheless, it's a colorful word, and perhaps the English word moved, at least as we typically think of it, as a sort of a movement from one place to the next versus the emotional being moved. I think it's a colorful word and adds certainly to, I think, the story of God's creating in verse 3. So with that, let me kind of yield back to you.